Hey there, this is Anne Marie, the anti-HR HR lady. I help my clients leave discriminatory, toxic, and hostile work environments with their bag, i.e., negotiated separations with severance. I'd like to teach employees about their workplace rights and give them tips and advice so that they're not afraid to assert them. Today, I want to talk a little bit about how racism shows up in our everyday lives. And I was inspired to make this video after watching a video on TikTok where a young lady who is a travel influencer, Black young lady, she lives in Mexico. I'm not going to say who she is because I don't want everybody running over there and, making comments because she has a right to her opinion. But she did inspire me to make this video. Those of you who follow me on multiple platforms know I also live in Mexico. I left the United States 2.5 years ago, and I live in Mexico. And she was talking about the fact that she had not experienced racism in Mexico, neither have I, but that she had seen and observed a lot of classism, so have I. But what she was missing in her chat was that classism is often tied to racism, right? That the people who usually are treated the worst in societies are people who are brown, who are the brown people or the indigenous people. But this is not a video about that. But one thing she said in the video did stand out to me. And it was at one point she made this declaration where she claimed that she was from Mobile, Alabama, and that she had never experienced racism ever in her life, all the years that she lived in Mobile, Alabama. And I found this questionable, to say the least, and problematic on multiple levels, because the reality is racism is not just one thing, especially as a Black American. Racism can be overt, and it can also be very benign. So the way that you may experience it, or one person may experience it, differs very much from how another person may experience it. It also, how it shows up and how and when you experience it has a lot to do with your socioeconomic status, what neighborhood you live in, and etc., right? But the reality is that if you are Black and you are Black American, especially in the United States of America, you have experienced racism, even if you don't recognize it as such, either because you don't know enough or because you choose not to, right? But the reality is that it is almost impossible, and I actually personally know people from Mobile, Alabama, to be from Mobile, Alabama, and to have never experienced racism and be Black. It's impossible. Now, could it be that no one has ever called you the N-word to your face? That the police have never pulled you over and racially profiled you in an overt way? That's possible. But racism shows up in our everyday lives in so many ways. It shows up in how you get treated when you go to the doctor's office, how long you wait. It shows up in how your teacher grades you in school, right? It shows up in what you have access to and what you don't have access to, even in terms of information, right? It's not always overt. A lot of it is quite benign. And the fact that it's benign is what has made so many of us stay in that system and not even recognize it, because we have literally been born into it and been raised and socialized to accept benign racism. It determines whether you get the promotion at work. They may never call you the N-word to your face, but do they need to if they're still treating you like the N-word, right? It shows up in what you get paid or offered for a job, right? I often tell people that even though I was an executive at my last job making quite a bit of money, that I was still the lowest paid executive in that organization. Why do you think that was, right? And so it's really one of those things that it can be benign and you may not even see it until you do. And then once you see it, you'll always see it. But a lot of us have been socialized not to see it and to not recognize it unless it's something very overt that happens to us. And then we say, oh, that was racism. But racism can be so many things, and how it shows up and how it affects different Black people is different. But it is really disingenuous and problematic to be, followed by, 15,000 people or whatever it is, and be out here telling people that you've never, ever experienced racism and you're from Mobile, Alabama. Because I just don't believe that is true. And that's just my opinion, but that's an opinion based on what I know to be real and true in the world, and especially in the United States. So I really think that, sometimes people say things and they don't really think about what they say. And they also say things because they want to be liked, they want followers, they want all these things. But it's really problematic to put things like that out there because it gives an impression that really isn't truthful. And it also reflects a lack of, awareness and self-awareness, because the reality, as I said, is that how racism shows up in American society is quite varied. Right. And it doesn't always have to be in your face. One of the things she said was, she's glad she never experienced it because she doesn't know how she would react to it if she did. And the fact is, yeah, you probably don't know how you'd react to it if it were overt. But the reality is that you've probably faced the really benign and covert type of racism multiple times and chose not to or didn't see it for what it was. Right. And so it's really important that we think about these things in a really critical way, especially if we're out here, putting these kind of information out to the masses of people. And I think it's really important also to be able to make the connection between classism and racism, because the reality is that anti-Blackness is everywhere in the world, in every single society. And so just because you're American, and so for that reason, you might not get treated in an overtly racist way, doesn't mean that the racism doesn't exist. Because the reality is that because of racism, certain groups of people are more likely to be poor, right? And then they are treated differently in society. But which comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? So this idea that it's just class. No, it's not just class. It is very much informed by anti-Blackness and anti-brownness, because at the end of the day, they're also Africans that were in Mexico, right? And they're also indigenous people who are also brown people, right? They're definitely not white Anglo-Saxon Spaniards, right? And so there's a lot of classism, there's a lot of colorism, and all of these things flow from racism. So it's very important, if you're going to talk about a subject, that you talk about it in an informed way so that you're not misleading people and giving people wrong information. But the reality is that class and colorism and all those things are still, all roads lead, as I always say, to white supremacy and the desire for white proximity, right? And so when you see it playing out amongst Black and brown people, it still flows from the same thing and the same place. And you've got to be able to make those connections. And we as Black people need to be able to make those connections and recognize that just because someone doesn't yell, N-word across the street or at the water cooler at work doesn't mean that you've never experienced racism. So tell me what you think in the comments. I'm sure that you will. And this is Anne Marie, the anti-HR HR lady. I'll see you guys in the next video.